welcome Maeve. You can see that what she's speaking tonight about is the fur trade and the coming of the revolution in New York. Maeve Kane is an associate professor and the director of graduate studies in the Department of History at the University at Albany, SUNY. She received her PhD from Cornell University, and her first book, Shirts Powdered Red, Haudenosaunee, Gender, Trade, and the Exchange Across 3 Centuries, argues that the Native American women used clothing and the fur trade to protect their nations from colonization, colonialism. In addition to teaching courses on early American and women's history, she regularly consults with museums across New York and the nation on the 250th of the coming of the American Revolution. Her work has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the New York Historical Society, and the New York State Archives, and she has been recognized as a distinguished lecturer by the Organization of American Historians. We learned about her through Will Tatum, our county historian, as her name was on a list of speakers willing to come to local historical societies to speak about the 250th anniversary of the Revolution. And so, without further delay, welcome, Maeve. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia.
I'm gonna have a.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much for being here on this beautiful, balmy Saturday night. I'm going to check real quick that I am in view on Zoom, and I am. So I'm going to hide that now so that you don't look at me talking while you're looking at me talking. So thank you so much. I want to thank Jim, Cynthia, Elliot, all of you for being here. What I'm going to be talking about tonight is the middle chapter of my first book, and I'll talk a little bit about the book projects that I'm working on right now. I really love local historical societies. I love coming out to places like this. This is where I did the majority of my research for my first book, because local historical societies have the good stuff. They have the local stuff that's so grainy and interesting and gives a lot of life to history. So thank you so much for hosting me tonight. So the argument I'm going to make to you tonight is that while the fur trade did not cause the American Revolution, it did significantly shape how the revolution looked in New York, and it looked very different than it looked in the rest of the American colonies. So that's the talk. You can all go ahead now. Or close the screen on Zoom. So the majority of what I'm going to be talking about, there we go. So this is a map from my first book. This is New York as we know it in 2020 when my book was in process. The dark areas are the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois reservations as they are now. You can see they're very small. What we now know as New York was all Haudenosaunee territory down into the very far northern part of Pennsylvania, all the way over to the Hudson River, where Haudenosaunee territory met Lenape territory. And then down to New York City, also majority Lenape territory. This landscape is vastly changed by the American Revolution. This is the same exact map in 1770. For my book, this is again a map from my first book. I marked it without the state borders that we know now, and with the indigenous names for their own nation, so Gahaga for Mohawk instead of the English word Mohawk, to really emphasize that until the American Revolution, there is no white settlement in what we now know as New York State. That is entirely a product of the American Revolution. The dotted line that you see there is the Stanwix line. That's a line that the British Crown drew in 1768. It's very similar to, a lot more people have learned about the 1763 Proclamation line. It's basically a line drawn down the Appalachians for the limit of white settlement. In New York, it is much further east. Like you can see that big jog down by Chemung there. That's where it meets the Proclamation line. It's much further east in what becomes New York State because the Haudenosaunee are much more politically and militarily powerful. Like they are really the major military power on the continent besides the British. They're a major deciding factor in the French and Indian War. They had been neutral for the early part of the French and Indian War, and it's really Haudenosaunee participation on the British side that allows the British to win the French and Indian War. And that is very much on everyone's minds with the American Revolution. So I'm going to talk about how that kind of changes the dynamics of what the landscape looks like here in New York tonight. The Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois are the Mohawk, Onondaga, Oneida, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora. I'm mostly going to be talking about Mohawk experience tonight, but the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee are all distinct. They have slightly different languages, and they're separate nations. So, the fur trade. The fur trade is like, we all kind of know the contours of it, the exchange of furs, mostly beaver, for cloth. By the eve of the American Revolution in 1770, it's the 3rd largest export out of New York. The others are grain and cattle to plantations in the Caribbean. So the fur trade is really like one of the pillars of the New York economy in 1770. It is such an important part of the economy that, like, the Albany area, the Mohawk River settlements, this is the far western and far northern extent of white settlement, wouldn't exist. Like, that's the entire reason that those places exist. And really, this is part of the argument I make in my book. What we call the fur trade is more appropriately the cloth trade. And I'm sorry, I'm very distracted by the echo of my own voice to the left. I will live, but if I'm pausing oddly, that's why.
Turn the sound.
So the cloth trade, what Native people are exchanging the furs for is majority cloth. People kind of have the stereotype of it's guns and alcohol, but if you look at both the number of purchases and the absolute value in what's bought, it's not guns or alcohol, it's cloth. Like, that's the majority what people are spending their furs on. And this is so extensive that you get images like these. This is some of my favorite images. What these are is hair combs, not the kind that like you decorative stick in a hairdo, but you just comb your hair with these. These are made by Native people. These are some of the only images that we have in North America that are made by Native people of Europeans. We have a ton of the reverse of kind of the stereotype of what Indians look like from European eyes, but we have very few of these. And I love these so much because they are kind of like the cell phone case or the water bottle or the laptop sticker of their day, where it's like everybody's got one. And they're kind of decorated. Everybody's got kind of a personalized one, so you can tell whose is whose when you go to grab something. But the stickers on the back of your cell phone or on your kid's Stanley Cup don't necessarily mean anything. It's like, oh, that's neat. I like that color. My daughter is into axolotls right now. And these are kind of similar. So these aren't like, oh, Europeans are spiritual beings. These are like, oh, that's a weird looking guy. And you get a sense of this in these images here, where you see Europeans depicted very similarly, and like they jump out as Europeans because they've got the hats, they've got the buttons, and they got the weird pants situation. Like that's very notable to Native people. Whereas the one Native woman that is pictured on your far left is unmarked because she's normal. Like, she's not remarkable. She knows what she looks like, and everybody else around her knows what she looks like. So this is so extensive, like this is such a deeply ingrained part of how people understand each other, that in a lot of Native languages in the Northeast, including the languages of the Haudenosaunee, Europeans are called either hat people or Dutch people. Not white, but the button people. So cloth and clothing becomes a really important part of how people understand each other. Both Native people understanding Europeans, but also how Europeans understand Native people. And people are also extremely aware of that. Like, clothing is a really foundational part of how we understand each other, but it's also a really unspoken part of how we understand each other. Like, this guy with the Albany shirt, like I knew immediately when he walked in, he has some kind of connection. And like, that's obvious because he's got the text on. But like, you also understand me sitting here in front of you differently than if I rolled up in like my ratty sweatshirt and pajama pants that I'm like, I have a 7-year-old that I hang out with, you know, in just ratty sweatpants and not my blazer. Like those things communicate different things, right? So we all kind of understand those messages. So in New York, what we have on the eve of the American Revolution is this political situation where the fur trade has made New York very politically and militarily important in a way I'll talk about more in a second. We have the fur trade reveals a lot of ethnic tensions between Europeans because of the fur trade, and that messaging around clothing, the way that people understand clothing, creates a racial tension between Native people and Europeans. So the fur trade is contributing to all three of those things. This is a page of an account book by a fur trader. This is kept by Jealous Fonda in the 1760s in the Mohawk River Valley. And yes, he is the ancestor of those Fondas, all of those Fondas. And this account page in particular is not significant by itself. This is Sawistawa. This is a Seneca woman. This is a woman who would have lived near what's now Buffalo, coming all the way out to what's now Albany, several hundred miles to buy. She bought a blanket. She bought a piece of gartering is like used to hold your socks up, a shirt, another blanket, and then she pawned a belt to pay for some of this. So you have a pretty brisk trade in, again, majority cloth. The thing that's interesting about Jealous Fonda in particular is he lived along the Stanwix line, that dotted line of the western extent of white settlement in New York. And he in particular is really interesting because he sold to both Native people and white people. Like same exact objects in towns that were mixed, often 50-50 Native people and white people. And New York is really unique in that respect. I think when we think of early America and colonial America, we think of like white people establish towns, Native people do not live near them. That's kind of the story of colonialism that we have. New York is really unique in that, especially along that Stanwix line, you had people living across the street from one another. There are towns along the Stanwix line where you would have a white person's door on one side of the street, a Native person's door on the other side of the street. Like literally you're looking at neighbors. So people attended the same churches. There were several congregations in these towns that were almost exactly 50-50 Native and white. You have people buying the same kinds of objects from traders like Jealous Fonda. But if you go through these account books, like what these are basically like itemized receipts. Like if I took your receipt from Target and I read through it in real detail, you can tell a lot about a person, right? Like what are they buying? What do they care about? What are they wearing? And this is in part, I mean, actually, I messed up my order of my slides here. I'm gonna go with this one first instead. This is what they're wearing. These women are typical of the communities that would have been living along the Stanwix line. The Mohawk woman on the left has a cradle board with a baby in the back. The strap over her head is called a burden strap, and it's used to hold the baby up. And then the woman on the right is pretty typical of Dutch, English, Scottish, German women in the Albany area and the Hudson Valley here. So these are the women, and men's clothing looks similarly, where you have Native men kind of distinct from European men in the area. These are the women that are buying from traders like Jealous Fonda. They're buying blankets, they're buying Strouds, they're buying shirts. They're buying the same things from the same people, and you would not mistake these women for each other, right? They're very distinct. Because what these women are doing is they create very specifically and deliberately, and you see this in what they're buying, but also the occasional glimpses that we have of how they talk about what they're buying, that they're really aware of what, again, their neighbors are wearing, what their neighbors are wearing to church every Sunday. And they really go out of their way to not look alike. Native people do not buy shoes, they do not buy pants, they for the most part don't buy hats that Europeans wear. There's some similarities in things like the color palette that these women are wearing, where we have kind of the light colored jacket on top. But it's then paired with, there's no apron for the Mohawk woman. You have a much less full skirt. Her skirt is higher because she owns her cornfields that she's working in every day. The Dutch woman on the right is probably working in a garden or a dairy. She's definitely doing housework. And you can see her ankles. My students think that's very surprising, but like women worked. Women always worked. So she is doing some kind of work, but she's not doing the same kind of agricultural work that the Mohawk woman is doing. So you get this emerging racial identity that's built first in clothing. Europeans don't have a sense of what we would call race now in the 18th century. That's something that emerges over the course of the 18th century, and it emerges in part from things like clothing. So that's one level where the fur trade is going to really shape what happens during the course of the American Revolution. The other level is geographic and ethnic tensions. So geographically, New York is really the key to the colonies, and it's talked about and written about that way by the British administration. The British Crown really tries to hang on to New York during the French and Indian War because the Haudenosaunee are seen as the shield for the American colonies, and the British write about them really explicitly. Massachusetts in particular is like, yes, please pour money into New York in a way that we would find shocking now for the defense of New York. Please keep the Haudenosaunee happy, because otherwise the French and their Indian allies will come down New York to attack Massachusetts, which did happen several times. So the British government really went out of its way to court the Haudenosaunee as this shield to the rest of the American colonies for the French and Indian War. But that also meant that the Haudenosaunee as allies and not subjects of the eventual American government were really militarily key to protecting this really important area. And we see this in in a set of illustrations that a museum in Canada did based on one of the chapters of my book. We see this, how the British Crown is thinking about this in how they interact with Haudenosaunee people kind of moving through New York. So this set of characters, the three ladies in the middle are the Desaulniers sisters. They are a set of merchants in Montreal in the 1740s and 1750s. They never get married. They tell the French and then later British government that they buy ginseng from the Indians to sell to China. And they did some of that, but mostly what they did was extremely illegal, which is they were not allowed to export furs out of Montreal except through a monopoly company set up by the French government. And the Desaulniers smuggled them out and employed people like the woman on the far left, Agnes, to ferry them down to Albany and have them sold out of Albany at a much better price to the guy on the far right, Robert Sanders, who made so much money in this illegal trade that he became mayor of Albany, who is the guy charged with regulating the illegal fur trade. So he becomes the enforcer of keeping people from trading illegally because he made so much money trading illegally. So what does this tell us about the revolution? What this tells us is that neither the French government in Canada when it existed, and then the British government that regulated Canada and New York at the time could regulate the movement of Haudenosaunee people. There are literally like dozens and dozens of letters from British and French forts up and down the Champlain Valley, the Lake George area, writing, yep, we saw Agnes go by again. Didn't stop her. We were super worried about starting a war if we stopped her, or we were super worried about losing her and her community's alliance in the next war if we stopped her. So Agnes is just one example of, there's a ton of Haudenosaunee Indigenous people moving up and down the Champlain and Lake George area, ferrying furs up and down. And the British were so concerned about losing them as allies militarily that they just let that happen. Even when it was highly illegal, even when they were very, very concerned that it was contributing to a possible loss of the war against French Canada. So geographically, we have Haudenosaunee control of New York. New York is kind of the key to the colonies at the time, and the British don't feel very firm control over that territory. But this illegal fur trade also contributed to dissension and a lot of conflict within New York, because it contributed to this feeling that the British were not truly in control of New York. New York is incredibly multi-ethnic. There's many different European ethnic groups in New York at the time. We all kind of know the Dutch New Netherlands story. In 1664, the Dutch lose New Netherland, it becomes British New York. But there's also, we have the French Huguenots, New Paltz most notably, but also a little further north. There's a bunch of Germans, a bunch of Scots-Irish, as well as newer and older English immigrants into the colony. And they do not get along at all. And part of the way that they don't get along is revealed in the fur trade. The British during the French and Indian War are really concerned with control of the Dutch at Albany. One British official writes of the Dutch at Albany that their soul is money, and if you cut them, they bleed coins. They would do anything for it. So they're really, present company accepted. So there's this like real suspicion on the part of the British of the Dutch because the Dutch are so invested in the trade. Robert Sanders, my friend here, is old Dutch heritage, and he's like the guy for the illegal fur trade. But then there's also this other group of refugee immigrant Germans that get settled. The refugee immigrant Germans, there's a bunch of religious wars in Europe in the 17th century and early part of the 18th century. And the British Queen Anne welcomes a lot of those refugees first into England and then is like, oh, geez, this is creating kind of a weird immigrant crisis situation in London. Let's ship them to New York. So these Palatine Germans show up in New York, and they're first settled kind of down in the lower Hudson Valley, in really squalid refugee camps in some cases. And they're eventually resettled out in the Mohawk Valley. And they're resettled out there because again, the old Dutch and old English families in Albany want is a friendly European population to start pushing into Haudenosaunee territories. But what they end up getting is German tenants who are very loyal to their Native American landlords. And the reason that they end up with that is you've got these huge Dutch landowners. Robert Sanders invests a bunch of his illegal fur trade money into speculating on Mohawk land, and it pisses the Mohawk off a lot. So the Mohawk end up courting these refugee Germans and saying, if you are loyal to us, you will be secure in your land, which is something that these refugees, these are people who had fled just decades of religious war tearing up Europe, find very enticing. So the Mohawk Valley ends up with this situation where you have these fairly poor German refugee farmers, very loyal to their Mohawk, some Oneida landlords, against major European ancestry landlords like Robert Sanders here. So it's a very mixed landscape. And as a result, you also get a bunch of accusations of people like Robert Sanders here accusing small German tenant farmers of engaging in the illegal fur trade. And like, maybe they were, but so was Robert Sanders, right? So the fur trade kind of gets used as this political tool to kind of push people out of these spaces of like, if you're too loyal to your Mohawk landlord, you get pushed with this charge of illegal fur trading, even though everybody kind of knows that Robert Sanders is on the take here as well. So when we get to the American Revolution itself, all of these things kind of boil over. In 1775, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy declared neutrality. They tried to stay out of the American Revolution entirely because from the Haudenosaunee perspective, this is not their fight. The Haudenosaunee are not subjects of the British Crown. They're not subject to the New York government the way that American colonists are. They are allies. This is another country. And you see this expressed in a lot of the ways that they treat the Americans or talk to the Americans. In several treaty conferences where people like George Washington, Peter Schuyler are specifically trying to court Haudenosaunee alliance, Haudenosaunee chiefs say, this is a fight between a father and his children. We, the Haudenosaunee uncles, will stay out of this fight. And there's a couple of things going on with that metaphor specifically. One, I think we all kind of get the father and his children, like that's a clear expression of this is what we think of your structure of authority, that the British king is in charge of you guys, please go away. But the Haudenosaunee uncles is also a really charged metaphor in Haudenosaunee and other Indigenous groups' diplomacy, in a matrilineal society, where this is a society where women own land, women decide how that land will be used for farming or distributed between families. The person who educates young men is not the father, but it's the mother's brother. Like your mother's brother's in charge of your political education. Divorce is incredibly easy in these societies. There's several instances where European men were divorced by their native wives when she just took his shit and put it outside the door and said, see you never. And the guys are like, she can't do that, can she? And then they go to the chiefs and they're like, yeah, she super duper can. So the mother's brother is a much more important educational figure, family figure, etc. So the Haudenosaunee in these early negotiations are saying, we're going to stay out of this fight that you're having with your father, but we are here to educate you. So kind of positioning themselves in this way within their own frameworks, in this way that they expect to be understood. But this also leads to some resentment on the part of people who become the patriots in the American Revolution. New York, as in just speaking in general terms, is one of the most loyalist colonies in what becomes the United States. It's much more a hotbed of loyalism than any of the other colonies, and it's held by the British for a large part of the war. And that's because a lot of the really rich guys like Robert Sanders throw in for the Americans, for the patriot cause. So New York is this situation where the very, very wealthy, the large landholders are all in on the American cause because they think that this is their key to pushing past the Stanwix line, opening up a lot more land speculation in Indian territories. And they think it's also going to throw off the economic system and allow them to enrich themselves without British restraint. But you also have this large population of people like the German tenant farmers who really, really resent that class, that feel like they have been shut out of landowning and therefore voting in the New York Assembly or for the New York Assembly. And that population feels that the Robert Sanderses of the world want to impose taxation without representation on the lower classes. So New York is a very strange landscape in that respect. We look very different than some of the other colonies. So that's part of the reason that Native people are like, not our problems. I'll do Q&A at the end. So you also have, for those communities along the Stanwix line, you also have this kind of resentment of, again, kind of class level issues. This is communities where we have Native people on one side of the street, white people on the other side of the street. And there's some level of resentment of Native landholding, that people who are maybe not Robert Sanders wealthy, Robert Sanders owns a lot of land as a result of his illegal fur trading, but maybe one step below and want to become Robert Sanders, resent that they have a Mohawk landlord, resent that their Mohawk landlord owns that land and is maybe a step more wealthy appearing than them. So the Haudenosaunee remained neutral up through 1777 and 78. There are some communities that ally formally with the British and participate in raids at things like the Battle of Oriskany, Battle of Wyoming, but the majority of the Haudenosaunee population is neutral until fairly late in the war. But in 1777, 1778, just all hell breaks loose with respect to New York. And there's a couple reasons for that. The primary reason I would argue to you is that George Washington specifically gets very, very worried about the geographic key that is New York. Washington becomes really heavily involved in planning a raid or a campaign that I'm going to talk about in a moment here. Because he's so concerned about the loyalism in New York, because he's so concerned about British control of New York. New York, just like Agnes came down the Lake Champlain and Lake George Valley in the French and Indian War, George Washington is concerned that the British are going to bring troops, supplies, and artillery down the Lake Champlain Valley from Montreal and into the heart of the American colonies. So British control of New York is very, very frightening. Haudenosaunee neutrality, they're starting to trend towards formal British alliance by this point in the war. Washington thinks if he can strike first, he will prevent that, disable them militarily. So what kicks off the planning starts in 1777 and it starts to come to fruition in 78 and then later in 79. There's a series of small raids in the Mohawk Valley that kind of start with grassroots, these kind of aspiring Robert Sanderses. These aren't our German refugee farmers. These are Anglo-Dutch families that are kind of one step above economically of those. Haudenosaunee is one of these settlements along the Stanwix line. And there's a series of nighttime raids in the fall of 1777 where these kind of middling aspiring landowners attack their Mohawk and Oneida neighbors. There's a series of coordinated attacks by the Committee of Safety in the Mohawk Valley that drives out a bunch of Mohawk families in the middle of the night about 3 a.m., literally drives them from their homes and steals all their stuff. Jealous Fonda was sent to investigate these raids by the Continental Congress because he knew the area so well. And he said that the whole is so great, it cannot be noted. Like, these are his neighbors. These are people he had been selling to for decades, and he couldn't even get a handle on how much had been stolen. Gansevoort here is also investigated this series of raids, and he wrote that it happened because Canajoharie is one of these settlements on the Stanwix line. It's abounding with every necessary, so it's remarked that the Indians live much better than most of the Mohawk River farmers, the white farmers. Their house is very well furnished with all necessary household utensils, so ascribing to it this kind of class resentment of these native families. And this was also about material objects on like a real basic level. This is about taking people's sense of safety in their homes, that your neighbors come and drive you from your home in the middle of the night. This pushes a big Mohawk and Oneida refugee population into Canada. But there was also kind of a clothing performance aspect to it afterwards. Gansevoort and Fonda also wrote that these Committee of Safety raid leaders, they gave Native women's clothing, like what I showed you on that slide earlier, to their wives and daughters to wear, and that they saw them wearing it around town. And I see the faces in the audience. It's a really like visceral, the 18th century, people didn't wear clothes or didn't own as much clothing as we might have now. And even with as much clothing as we own now, like, it's a really visceral, intimate, personal thing of like, you literally take somebody's kind of most personal objects and you give them to somebody else. So it's really about kind of this taking of safety from women. And that's a really clear message in the 18th century. In the 18th century, there's this sense of men exist in the public sphere, kind of outward facing, and therefore they're legitimate targets in war because they have put themselves out there. Whereas women are supposed to be in the domestic sphere, which is safe, which is protected from war, protected from conflict. And Europeans had a very similar sense of war crimes to what we have now. This is the era where a lot of that gets codified. And those kind of attacks on women, non-combatants, are meant to terrify. They were considered war crimes in the 18th century as we would consider them now. So that action of the Committee of Safety raiding people's homes at 3 a.m, taking women's clothes and giving it to their wives and daughters, that really says, we don't consider you women enough to be safe. that you are not within the boundaries of people that we consider worthy of being safe from war in this way. This culminated, so the Committee of Safety Raids in 77 culminated and were the basis for what George Washington gave very specific orders for in 1779 for what's called the Sullivan-Clinton campaign. And Washington really explicitly based his orders for the Sullivan-Clinton campaign on the Committee of Safety Raids, and gave very explicit orders that there should be as many women and children taken hostage as possible. The exact quote is escaping me right now, but so that the Indians will be prevented from acting hostilely against us for fear of what we will do to their women and children. And this is again when the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is for the most part neutral. There's a few communities that had allied with the British, but the majority at this point are neutral. And what ended up happening is in 1779, the Continental Congress made its largest single appropriation to that date in the war. This is a point coming just a little bit after the French alliance that kind of made the new United States financially solvent for the first time. And what they do is they use some of that money for the Sullivan-Clinton campaign. It's $1 million. It's a quarter of the Continental Army budget for that year, the largest single expense, and about a quarter of Continental Army regulars are assigned to this campaign. Like that's how important this objective is to Washington, and he's very personally involved in planning of it. And it strikes very deep into the heart of Haudenosaunee territories. So this is a map of Sullivan's campaign that kind of went up the Susquehanna River from Pennsylvania and into what's now the Finger Lakes area of New York. And their objective, and you see this in the letters of the Sullivan campaign officers in Washington's orders to them, were to lay waste to Haudenosaunee territory. They were specifically ordered to burn cornfields and orchards in the late summer and early fall. This is when the harvest, right before the harvest would be coming in, both to devastate Haudenosaunee food stores for that winter and seed corn stores. So this is a long-term attack. They burned about 40 towns, more than 160,000 bushels of corn, and like really laid waste to orchards that were like multiple decades old, really attacking food stores. Because for two reasons. One is just as now, logistics are the base of military strength. An army marches on its stomach, right? And that's very true for Haudenosaunee military power. That's how they had been so instrumental in the French and Indian War. That's why Washington specifically feared how powerful they could be if they entered the war on either side in the Revolution. But also because it's controlled by women. Again, this is a matrilineal society. This is part of the reason that pair of images of the two women, where the native women look so distinct from the white woman, Europeans did not like that. They found that very uncomfortable. And you see that also in a lot of writing. A lot of Americans and earlier British writers were really concerned with that distinction of, and this is where the title of my book, Shirts Powdered Red, comes from, that Native people could take clothing that Europeans also wore and transform it so radically and so unrecognizably because it was emblematic of their control of their own territory. That it was really like that visual distinction between families, even though they went to the same church, even though they lived across the street from one another, even though they bought the same kind of things from Jealous Fonda, they remained so very resolutely distinct. That was a big threat to the kind of land speculation expansion into Indian lands in the West that a lot of aspiring Robert Sanderses hope to do. So that visual is really threatening in a lot of ways. So what Washington hoped to accomplish with the Sullivan-Clinton campaign was the total destruction of Haudenosaunee military and political power. And he accomplished that for like a winter, The winter of 1779 into 80 was very bad for the Haudenosaunee. There were very few casualties during the Sullivan-Clinton campaign itself. About 40 women and children were taken captive. There were murders and probably sexual assault of several Haudenosaunee women during the campaign, but there wasn't like a huge like burning of towns or excuse me, casualty of people in the burning of towns. The majority of Haudenosaunee deaths came in the winter of 1780. At British Fort Niagara, a lot of refugees died from lack of food. What Washington hoped to accomplish was the long-term devastation of Haudenosaunee country. And he achieved that for the winter of 1780, there we go. But what happened in 1781 was the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, for the most part, allied with the British. What Washington had hoped to prevent, he actually, I would argue, to caused. James Madison wrote to Jefferson that rather than exterminating the Haudenosaunee, Washington had exasperated them. Because what happened was redoubled raids that were even worse than what had been happening previously in 1777. And while the British did lose the war, the Haudenosaunee were very involved in raiding a lot of civilian towns as a result of the Sullivan-Clinton campaign. So I would argue that Washington actually like majorly misstepped militarily and politically there. This also had long-term repercussions for the United States. So this is the signatories to the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua. This is the treaty between the United States and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy that governs Haudenosaunee-US relations now. Like this is still in effect. It has the same weight as constitutional law. So very high level. The Treaty of Canandaigua also has its legacy in this. The Haudenosaunee were still very much aware of the Sullivan-Clinton campaign. New York State in particular had tried to compress Haudenosaunee landholding in the 1780s very punitively. The first governor of New York State said that the Haudenosaunee should be made to discover some signs of repentance and vastly tried to constrict how much land the Haudenosaunee held. The 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua is somewhat unique in Indian territories in that it actually expanded the land held by Native people. Very unusual. Because what happens in the 1790s is the Haudenosaunee have been reduced militarily and politically, but they're still very important diplomatically. And in 1791, the United States lost its single largest casualty event with Sinclair's defeat in what's now Ohio. A large US Army trying to expand the United States into kind of Ohio-Indiana territory lost to a force of Native people in what's called the Northwest War or Pontiac's Rebellion. And these are not Haudenosaunee people out in Indiana and Ohio, but they care what the Haudenosaunee think. So the United States in 1794, after Sinclair's defeat, goes begging hat in hand to the Haudenosaunee, can you please negotiate on our behalf with these other tribes to the west, and please tell them to stop attacking us so much. And that's successful, and the Haudenosaunee used that as leverage to negotiate the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua, which really secures rights of free movement through that Lake Champlain, Lake George Valley that Agnes had moved back and forth from, because it was such a foundational part of Haudenosaunee rights as nations. And that has been written into US constitutional level law with the Treaty of Canandaigua. And just as a final note, the way that Haudenosaunee people thought about this long term is really written into how university scholars study this now. This is Kahano Caroline Parker. She was the first alumni of what is now the University at Albany, University of New York. The story of why the SUNY system started as a handful of Indian boarding schools is a totally different story that I talk about in the book. But it did. Caroline Parker is one of its first students. And she's thinking about this in the 1850s. What she is thinking about is in the 1850s, New York State was trying to circumvent the authority of the federal government in negotiating Indian treaties. States are not supposed to negotiate with Indian nations because they're separate nations. The United States has nation-to-nation relations with Indian nations. And the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua protected Indian reservations as sovereign nation territory. New York State wanted to expand its land holdings, wanted to extinguish all of those reservations that are within New York State in the 1850s. And people like Caroline Parker, that is not relevant, that's my file backup so I don't lose all of my books that I'm writing. Caroline Parker is about 21 years old, and she's asked by a young lawyer that she meets through her brother to make a set of Iroquois traditional clothes for what's now the State Museum. And this is what she makes. So she makes this at a time when Indian boarding schools are being pushed, at a time when New York State is trying to extinguish all reservation holdings. And Native women in New York are not wearing this on a daily basis in 1850. This is an echo of what women were wearing in the 18th century. By the 19th century, they're wearing pretty much the same thing as white women. And I would argue to you that she makes this at that moment because she's making an argument about her nation's continued existence through the revolution and via the fur trade. This is what Native women who were involved in the fur trade were buying, making, and wearing. And it's for that reason that their nations remained powerful enough to negotiate the Treaty of Canandaigua after the revolution. So at this moment in 1850, when the kind of pressure of colonialism is at its greatest in New York State, she makes this statement of ancient and traditional Haudenosaunee identity that is based in all of these things. And that's my book. That's kind of the 40-minute version of the book. My editor told me to flog the book here tonight, so I'm sorry I'm doing this. If you want to order through the Cornell University website, she gave me a discount if you order direct through the university website. The other thing, my personal website is at the top there, maevekane.net. The chapter that I talked to you about tonight on the American Revolution is available to read for free online there. I also have 2 chapters from my other works in progress that I'm working on. One project I'm working on is about how people use baptism to make communities right before the American Revolution. So how do you understand relationships between birth parents and godparents to make an American identity? And then the other book that I'm working on is how do we commemorate the American Revolution? We're going into the 250th of the Revolution, and that commemoration starts right after the American Revolution and really tells us a lot about who Americans think we are and how that's changed over time. So you can read a chapter from each of those projects. Only Shirts Powdered Red is published now. The other 2 I'm still working on. But you can read a chapter from each of those projects on my website. Thank you. Should I pause screen share for the folks on Zoom or should I leave something up?
You leave it up.
Okay, that's good. Okay, questions?
So many questions.
Yes.
First of all, very interesting talk, all sorts of stuff I didn't know about. So I'm missing probably context that you probably teach in Albany.
I hope I do.
Students. So my context is that, yeah, I know about the Dutch own, I'm from Dutch nationality, so the Dutch own New York, they give it up to the British for Suriname and basically, basically move up the Hudson Valley with the Livingstons and stuff like that, right? I understand that power relationship a little bit. You have a king across the sea, you have a state government, and they have local people that basically sort of like have a line of authority. But how did that line of authority look out west of that Stanwick line? I have no clue. How is it that we are, at least I was completely unaware that those people were considered both an economic and military power at the level of New York City.
Yeah. Okay. So for the folks on Zoom, in case the audio didn't pick up, the question was, what does the political authority look like west of the Stanwix line? So I'm not sure if, can the folks on Zoom see where my mouse is?
Yeah.
Yeah,
You-
okay.
you can see your
Okay.
cursor.
So we've got the Fort Stanwix line, and then we've got Fort Niagara, Fort Schlosser, and Fort Erie out here at kind of Niagara Falls area. The British government does not exist between those 2 points. This is like,
So what is this?
so the Haudenosaunee Confederacy exists. This is, yeah. So this is a nation separate from the British, the same way that like Canada is separate from the United States now. The way that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy functions politically is more like the United Nations than the United States. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy is 6 separate nations that negotiate with one another and kind of take many of the same actions, but they aren't, there's no like grand chief of the Haudenosaunee. There's 50, and this is how the Haudenosaunee kind of picture this in images, is there's a circle of clan matrons that face inward, and there's a circle of chiefs that face outward, and they are all co-equal. There's a certain number from each of the 6 nations, but all 50 of those have to reach consensus. The clan matrons who face inward deal with things like land boundaries, marriages within nations, things like that. The chiefs deal with diplomatic issues facing outwards. Those are the guys who are saying, we're your uncles, this is a fight between fathers and children. So the way that that functions between Stanwix and Niagara is they have to come to consensus. I kind of glossed over this period for the sake of time, but between 1775, when the Confederacy declares neutrality, and 1777, when the Committee of Safety raids happen, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is very divided. I would say as divided as the American colonies are. A lot of scholars these days say that the American colonies experienced the American Revolution like a civil war, especially someplace like Dutchess County here, like you have just families torn apart by this. And the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was similar because on the one hand, you have British promises to hold the Stanwix line. On the other hand, you have Americans pushing past the Stanwix line on the one hand, but also saying, if you ally with us, we'll protect your land. And that's like, land is the #1 concern for the Confederacy. So those promises, that pressure, the increasing American population pushing past the Stanwix line is deeply divisive. So the British aren't controlling that territory between Stanwix and Niagara, but the Haudenosaunee have their own political structure that they're trying to deal with.
And when you say you have the internal matriarchs of the 6 clans looking at each other, and then 50 chiefs around that looking outside, do they get together once a year? Do they? What does that mean when you say they have to reach consensus?
Yeah.
They have a United Nations building somewhere ready to go?
Kinda, yeah. Onondaga. Literally Onondaga here. This is very close to modern Syracuse. They didn't have like yearly meetings like call Congress to town. But like if so there's this spiritual figure called the Tadadaho. There's still a Tadadaho today. This is a specific chieftainship of Onondaga Nation. He'll occasionally send like messengers to other Haudenosaunee nations and say like, hey, we need to figure out like, are we allying with the British or with the Americans? And kind of call everybody into town. And yeah, they would physically meet at Onondaga.
So they come together for a couple of days, drink, eat, basically talk to each other, and then a consensus is reached. And do they appoint somebody then to go talk to Washington or Clinton or Sullivan?
Yeah, yeah, I'm sorry for the Zoom audience if I've been neglecting this. The question was, do they then appoint somebody to go talk to people? Yes, they do. So that's a large part of how that's a large part of how historians see this decision making in the records. So there's no Europeans at Onondaga when they meet. So like this isn't like you have the debate and then there's like one European guy sitting in. This is like they send a delegation to Albany to talk to Philip Schuyler, excuse me. And Philip Schuyler writes, I met with so and so, like these 4 Haudenosaunee guys from different nations, and they told me X, Y, and Z was decided by the Council of Chiefs. So a lot of what we know is from oral history, like Haudenosaunee historians have oral narratives of how this decision making happened, and we have Europeans writing about kind of this relay, like this telephone game of what they're told about the council. So yeah. But I would actually say this as a note on that, This is fairly similar to how European governments or colonial assemblies work in this period. Like there's a semi-regular meeting of the state assembly, but like if New York Governor Hunter wants to meet with the assembly or has some decision to make, he's like, hey guys, come to Albany. Let's drink a lot and make some decisions. And then also sends like guys to Pennsylvania or Virginia of like, Governor Hunter says X, Y, and Z. So it functions fairly similar to colonial governments in the same period. It's not that out of the normal.
And once the Onondaga, the Indian tribes, one needed to go to war, how did that work? They basically, the war chief sends out a message to all the tribes, and each of the 6 tribes sends a bunch of people. Fight that, like a Game of Thrones type of thing.
So for Zoom, the question is like, how does that function when there's a call
How's
to war?
Army muster.
Yeah, so for both Indigenous and colonial assemblies, like it's again, you kind of send out the call to the community of like, we're turning out. For the colonial side of this is a militia would be mustered. This is men over 18 who have like a citizenship obligation to perform military service. There's a similar, it's not exactly the same, but there's a similar kind of thing for Indigenous people where like, if the clan matron that you belong to, and you belong to a clan because of who your mother is, if the clan matron, who's the oldest woman in your line, says, we have an obligation to fight this fight, you go because your mom said so. But and that's kind of a glib way of saying it, but it's the same way of saying like, if you're in the militia, you go because your dad said so. It's a similar sort of obligation. So
I assume there were more Indians, Mohawks who on Okanogan. Sorry, I don't know how to say.
yeah,
Were more Indians than colonialists. Is that true?
depends on
They have-
how.
You said they had military power.
Yeah.
I assume they have a numerical superiority.
Yeah,
They've been there all.
yeah. After this, I want to check if we have questions on Zoom.
I'm sorry, this will be my last question.
So Haudenosaunee numerically outnumber white New Yorkers.
Okay.
So the military power is not so much from numeric advantage flat. It's more about the geographic position that they control this really important territory. They move much faster than white armies. Like you see,
So
you said last question. I'll stick around afterwards if you want to talk, please. They move much faster than white armies, like white military leaders are absolutely astonished by how fast Native people can move just a ton of guys. And they also are able to like bring in a lot of Indigenous allies. The reason that the Haudenosaunee were so important in the 1790s in the Northwest War is because they can say to all of these people to the west of them, we need more help. We're going to pull in more numbers. So the Haudenosaunee maybe didn't have the absolute numbers. Like there's definitely more people in New York City than there are Haudenosaunee people total. Haudenosaunee people total in 1770 is like 50,000 people. And there's way more than that way more white people in New York City alone by that point. So there's way more Continental Army, but it's this combination of fast movement, geographic position, and alliance structure out to the west that makes them so militarily important. Promise I will stick around. We can talk more. Are there questions on Zoom? And then we got one in person.
You can ask. See if anyone has a question
Okay.
on Zoom. They can unmute and ask it.
Okay, for folks on Zoom, if you want to put it into the chat maybe, and if Jim sees anything in the chat, let me know, because I know we have 2 in the room here. So the gentleman in the middle here and then in the back.
The Indian population here is decimated. Just using this as the word.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, were the populations as decimated here as they were on the coast? That's really hard to tell, but it seems like it was not as bad. But not as bad is still really very bad. So something like, if you think about how COVID felt, where we had just a really destabilizing situation and just the fear of this new disease, Native populations are experiencing something like a new COVID every 2 to 3 years. The Mohawk scholar Susan Hill has called this apocalyptic. Like that's the level of population loss that we're talking. So the coast is like near total devastation. You have entire towns that are gone. What seems to have happened in Haudenosaunee territories in New York is you have this drop to about 50% of the pre-contact population, and then it bounces up. It doesn't ever bounce all the way back up in the 18th century, but it is never as bad as the coast, and it bounces back up by the 1770s. So 1770 with 50,000 Haudenosaunee, that's not as many as there were pre-contact, but it's also not the devastation we see on the coast.
Seems like that would be a fight and fighting disease at the same time.
Yeah, well, so part of the bounce back is that by the I'd call it the 1710s, you're no longer seeing these devastating waves of disease. Like you definitely are seeing just absolutely terrible levels of epidemic disease in Western New York in the 17th century. But by about 1710, that appears to have backed off, where you'll get occasional outbreaks of something like smallpox, but you're not talking about like the entire town has it, that kind of thing. So yeah, I would say that that's part of the reason that a nation like the Lenape is not in the same position as the Haudenosaunee. Like the Lenape are absolutely devastated by this point. And they are not a major factor in the revolution. They're not in the same geographic position, even though they're kind of in the same Hudson Valley region, because they've been much worse affected by epidemic disease. Yeah, thank you for the question. In the back and then over here.
Yeah, you were talking about the woman who was smuggling the furs down from Montreal. Just like, can you talk a little bit like logistically, like how did she do it? Did she have a canoe or a barge? Did she
Yeah.
have furs? Like I have to imagine these culture like enormously heavy and she's doing it herself, like.
Yeah, so she's not doing it herself. I should have, I've compressed a lot for the sake of time. This slide is one full chapter of the book.
Repeat the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was logistically, how does this smuggling work up and down the Champlain Valley with the one woman here? And this is, for the sake of brevity, Agnes stands in for a lot of other people. So logistically, like one person did do this. We do have some records of like one woman or one man was doing a small operation, but usually it was like 4 to 20 adults in a party where you'd have a couple of people in a canoe and just these enormous bales of fur, like about half the size of this table, like a 4 foot by 4 foot cube that's a couple 100 pounds. And it's put into a canoe and paddled. And things are a lot easier to transport by water. That's why the Erie Canal is so revolutionary for New York. So somebody like Agnes, if you can get it into a canoe, Agnes could transport about 1,000 pounds of fur. Wouldn't be a great time, it'd be a lot of work, but it's a lot easier on paddling than it is. The major sticking point logistically is portages, where you get to these points where the river or the lake is not navigable. And this is the place where these smuggling operations are the most like visible in the historic record, because that's where British and French governments put forts. And these are the places where we have soldiers writing, yep, we saw Agnes again. She was carrying a barrel of furs. We just walked her go on by. And she just does that for like a week, carrying stuff past these same guys. And they're like, hey, Agnes. And they just don't do anything about it. So like these forts are nominally there to control those logistical choke points, but they don't because they're so afraid of the political consequences. But often the parties are bigger than that, so you have more people walking past the checkpoints. But that also makes it kind of higher stakes if there's a confrontation of like the soldiers don't want to get into it with like 20 Mohawk warriors or whatever. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
The Erie Canal was built in 1825.
Yeah.
So that was when the Haudenosaunee still had major control.
That's passed. So for the Zoom audience, the question was, what happens with the Erie Canal in this story? So this is my 2020 map. So 1794, the Haudenosaunee, the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua guarantees pretty much this western triangle here, and then much larger reservations for the other nations. The reason that someone like Gahano Caroline Parker is so important in 1850 is that New York makes the Erie Canal possible, wishing a lot of the land gained by the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua. So this is the 2020 map. This is really being put into place in the 18-teens, in the 1820s by the New York State government negotiating a bunch of illegal treaties, because a state is not supposed to have nation-to-nation relations, and Indigenous nations are separate nations under US law.
So was there any compensation involved, or was the land just taken on the treaties of war?
The question was there compensation involved? Often very nominal compensation, like we're talking pennies on the dollar. So there's a couple of reservations out here near what's now Buffalo, that were basically signed away for what would have been like a workman's wages for 2 years in the 18-teens, like very, very low amount. Especially compared to like, this is where like the modern downtown city of downtown Buffalo is. Like the value of that land in the early 19th century was already worth much more than what it was paid for.
So
Yeah.
what leverage forced the Indigenous people to, make this sham of a deal?
Honestly, military threat. For the Zoom audience, the question was what pushed people into this. A lot of military threat. New York State has a couple of standoffs with militia. New York State militia is brought, and there's threats of removal of Native people. New York State is kind of a testing ground for Indian removal, that's eventually put into place in Georgia with the Cherokee, the much more well-known case. The Haudenosaunee, for various reasons, are able to hang on to a small amount of land base in New York State. But it's the same kind of story that we know from the Cherokee case of like, there's this standoff with people are pushed really to breaking point. There's also like severe debt. There's a return of epidemic disease in the 19th century. There's a series of waves of cholera epidemics across reservations, where Haudenosaunee people in the early 19th century are in a very different position than they are in the 1770s. Yeah.
There's still confrontation. Years ago, they tried to put on the Indian reservations, to charge tax on cigarettes. And apparently we had a no say road that was I gifted the Indians, and went out and opposed it. Because she tried wasn't pay sales tax. There was a big legal battle going on in this.
Yeah.
Latest.
Yeah, for the Zoom audience, there's a comment from the audience. I think this is I-87, right? Or is it 90? It's one of the two big interstates. There's been a series of confrontations with Seneca Nation over cigarette and gas tax and like maintenance of one of the big interstates out west. Because like Treaty of Canandaigua is still in force, and that's the treaty that says there's free movement. These are sovereign nation territories, and part of being a sovereign nation territory is the US has no more tax authority. New York State has no more tax authority in those territories than it does over sales in Canada. Like the US doesn't collect sales tax on Canadian gas or Canadian cigarettes, right? So it's the same kind of idea. Is there any questions on Zoom or?
Nothing.
Okay. Yeah, yes.
I read in some of the Quaker minutes that members of this meeting were, and all New York meetings
Yeah.
were paying periodically into a fund called the Indian Fund.
Yeah,
Which was for, I think, education and helping represent the Indians of Western New York
yeah.
in holding on to their land. Do you know much about that?
Okay, I don't know specifically. The question from Cynthia was that Quakers from this meeting were paying into the Indian Fund, and what was that for? I didn't know about folks from this meeting specifically, but the New York oh, I forget. The New York Yearly Friends Meeting, is,
Yearly.
yeah,
All were contributed to the New York.
yeah, so this fund, like, this is why, in large part, the Treaty of Canandaigua looks the way it does. The Quakers are heavily involved as translators and negotiators on the behalf of the Haudenosaunee. I wasn't sure about this meeting specifically, and for the sake of time, I glossed over this, but yeah, the Quakers are like specifically invited in a lot of, to the majority of Indian treaties that the Haudenosaunee negotiate, because the Quakers are seen as like a neutral party. I would argue, and this is part of what I argue in the book, I would argue that the Quakers are not entirely neutral. They set up a lot of schools on Indian reservations that become a model for later boarding schools. So like people later in the 19th century look back at these schools to learn lessons of like how to do colonialism better. But in the 18th century, at the time that they're running, the Haudenosaunee specifically often invite the Quakers in because the Quakers don't try to buy their land the way that the Presbyterians or the Anglicans who are doing the same thing do. So the Quakers are respected, I guess. The Quakers are welcomed in that way a lot more than other denominations are. Specifically because they don't speculate in land. Yeah. Other questions? You guys are like hopping for a Saturday night. Great.
Thank you once
Yeah,
again.
thank you so much. Thank you all for the questions.
And thanks for a listening audience, as we used to say, but this was very fascinating.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming and being with us. And
Should
we're
I
gonna buy
do-
your book.